The world was dying by inches. It was the 5th century of the Christian era, and the Western Roman Empire, once the undisputed master of the known world, from the misty shores of Britannia to the sun-scorched deserts of Syria, was a ghost of its former self. It was a magnificent corpse, still twitching with occasional spasms of life, propped up by ceremony, the fading memory of glory, and the sheer inertia of 1,000 years of history. The eternal city of Rome, the throbbing heart of this vast body, had already been brutally violated in 410 by the Visigothic king Alaric. The shockwave of that event had rippled across the civilized world, a metaphysical wound from which the Roman psyche would never truly recover. Saint Jerome, writing from his monastery in Bethlehem, lamented, "The city which had taken the whole world was itself taken." The imperial throne had fled the symbolic vulnerability of Rome for the marshy, defensible lagoon city of Ravenna, a place of intricate mosaics and even more intricate conspiracies. Here, emperors like the ineffectual Honorius and his nephew Valentinian III were less monarchs and more prizes for scheming generals, powerful eunuchs and ambitious courtiers. Their power, once absolute from the Tyne to the Tigris, now extended little further than the horizon visible from Ravenna's high towers. Beyond the crumbling limestone walls of its cities, a dark, chaotic tide was rising, eroding the very foundations of the classical world. Germanic tribes, Vandals, Suebi, Alans, had carved out kingdoms within the very provinces of the empire, living on the land as autonomous, often hostile entities. In Hispania, the Visigoths were forging a powerful, independent realm. In North Africa, the breadbasket of the West, the Vandal kingdom under Gaiseric, was growing into a formidable naval power. And from the vast, unknown steppes of the East, a new and terrifying force was gathering, a storm of hoofbeats and fire that would test the very limits of the civilized world. This was the age of Flavius Aetius. His story is not one of restoring a golden age, but of a desperate, brilliant, and ultimately tragic holding action against the inevitable night. He was the last great Roman general, the man who would fight, not for a glorious victory that would echo through the ages, but for the simple, brutal survival of an idea. He was the last wall against the deluge, and his story is the story of the fall of Rome itself. His life began not in the gilded marble halls of Rome's Palatine Hill, but in the gritty, pragmatic world of the late Roman military frontier, where Latin was spoken with a barbarian accent and survival was the only philosophy. Born around 391 AD in the dusty garrison town of Dura Storum, in the province of Moesia Inferior, on the lower Danube, Aetius was a product of the New Rome, a synthesis of the Old World and the New. His father, Gaudentius, was a distinguished magister militum, a master of soldiers, a man of humble, likely Scythian, origin who had risen through sheer military merit, a testament to the changing face of the Roman army. His mother, whose name is lost to history, was a wealthy and noble Italian Roman woman, connecting him to the ancient aristocratic families who still believed their bloodline was the empire's true backbone. This dual heritage, the barbarian military caste and the ancient Roman aristocracy, would define him, making him a figure of suspicion to both purist senators and barbarian kings, yet granting him a unique understanding of the fractured world he was destined to navigate. His education was not in the rhetoric of Cicero or the philosophy of Seneca, but in the stark realities of power and survival. While boys of his age in Italy were practicing declamations, the young Aetius was sent as a high-ranking hostage to the court of Alaric the Visigoth, a common practice to ensure the fidelity of his father and the adherence to treaties. There, amidst the rough-hewn halls of the Gothic camp, he learned their guttural language, their customs of feasting and boasting, their way of war, the relentless, thunderous charge of the comitatus, the sacred bond of loyalty to a chieftain that far outweighed any abstract allegiance to a distant emperor in Ravenna. This was his first, brutal education in the new political reality. But his schooling was not yet complete. In a twist of fate, he was later exchanged and sent as a hostage to the camp of the Huns, the most feared and enigmatic of all the steppe peoples. It was here, in the saddle, living on a diet of mare's milk and raw meat softened under the saddle, that Aetius received his postgraduate education in the art of war. He learned to think like a Hun, to move like a Hun, to understand the terrifying potential of their endless herds of hardy steppe ponies and their deadly composite bows, which could punch through Roman armor at 150 yards. He learned their tactics of the feigned retreat, the envelopment, the sheer psychological terror of their mobile warfare. He came to know their leaders, first King Rua, and later his nephews, Bleda, and the younger, more intense Attila. What seemed to the effete senators in Rome a barbaric and shameful exile was in fact forging the one man who understood, with visceral intimacy, both the dying world of Rome and the brutal, vital world that was coming to replace it. He was becoming bilingual not just in tongue, but in the very grammar of power. The Rome to which Aetius returned as a young man was a cauldron of intrigue, violence, and decadent decay. The throne was a prize, the real power held by a succession of powerful generals like Constantius III and Flavius Felix, who ruled through puppet emperors. The court was a snake pit of factions. The Italian aristocracy, the military strongmen, the powerful eunuchs of the imperial chamberlain, and the influential bishops. Aetius, leveraging the profound connections and the private army of Hunnic mercenaries he had cultivated during his time as a hostage, plunged into this deadly game without hesitation. His first major move was a testament to his unique position and cold-blooded ambition. In 425, following the death of the usurper Emperor Joannes, he arrived in Italy with a vast army of 60,000 Huns, a force he had raised from his personal connections on the steppe. He was just too late to prevent the installation of the Empress Galla Placidia, daughter of Theodosius the Great, and her young son, Valentinian III, as the legitimate rulers of the West. But his army was a raw, undeniable power that could not be ignored. Instead of fighting a costly and uncertain battle, the shrewd Galla Placidia co-opted him. She bought off his Hunnic army with a massive payment of gold and appointed Aetius to the high military command of Magister Militum per Gallius, master of soldiers in Gaul. This was the beginning of his life's work. For the next 3 decades, Aetius would not sit on the throne in Ravenna, but he would be the empire in everything but name. His ultimate title, Magister Utriusque Militia, master of both services of soldiers, would become synonymous with the last, defiant breath of Roman power in the West. He was the general, the diplomat, the administrator, and the kingmaker. Gaul, the ancient province conquered by Julius Caesar 5 centuries earlier, was the bleeding edge of the empire, a microcosm of its triumphs and failures. It was a vast, fractured landscape of competing loyalties and crumbling infrastructure. Roman cities like Arelate, Arles, and Narbo, Narbonne, clung desperately to their Latin culture, their forums and aqueducts standing as lonely monuments to a receding past, while Germanic foederati, allied tribes, held vast swathes of territory, their allegiance to Ravenna nominal at best, a convenient fiction. The Burgundians had settled on the Middle Rhine. The Visigoths in Aquitaine were a constant, simmering threat, and Frankish and Alemannic warbands pressed relentlessly across the crumbling Rhine frontier, the limes that had once held the barbarian world at bay. Into this chaotic, simmering cauldron, Aetius rode not as a classic conqueror, but as a fixer, a diplomat, and when necessary, a hammer of terrifying force. He was the ultimate pragmatist in an age of ideology and pride. He understood with chilling clarity that the old Roman legions, the disciplined heavy infantry that had built the empire, were gone, replaced by a more fluid, mercenary-based military. His army was a patchwork reflection of the empire itself. The core was his own bucellarii, his personal household troops, often of barbarian origin, fiercely loyal to him personally, rather than to the abstract idea of Rome. Then came the tattered remnants of the Roman field army, the comitatenses, a shadow of their former selves. And most crucially, there were his Huns. This relationship with the Huns was the cornerstone of his power, a devil's bargain that would define his career. He used the barbarian tribes as pieces on a grand strategic chessboard, playing them against each other with a master's touch. His strategy was one of controlled chaos. When the Burgundians under King Gundahar grew too ambitious, expanding their kingdom on the Rhine beyond the limits Aetius would tolerate, he did not send in the legions. He unleashed his Hunnic allies upon them in 436. The destruction was near total, a calculated act of genocide meant to terrify all of Gaul into submission. The Burgundian kingdom on the Rhine was annihilated. Chronicles speak of 20,000 Burgundians slain. This horrific event would echo through the centuries, immortalized in the epic Germanic poem the Nibelungenlied. It was brutal, but for Aetius, it was necessary. He was not fighting to restore Roman provinces to direct rule, that was now a fantasy, but to maintain a precarious equilibrium, a system where he was the indispensable arbiter. the only man who could summon or restrain the monsters from the east. He repeated this pattern across Gaul. He used the Franks to check the Visigoths, settling the Alans under King Goar in Orléans to act as a buffer against the Barcaudai, peasant rebels, who represented the internal collapse of Roman authority. He fought the Visigoths themselves at the Battle of Arles in 430 and 435, not to destroy them, but to bloody their nose and force them back into the status of reluctant allies. He was a whirlwind of activity, constantly on the move from one crisis to the next. His correspondence, fragments of which survive, shows a man dealing with everything from grain shipments for beleaguered cities to the complex genealogies of Frankish petty kings. It was a dizzying high-stakes game, a constant dance on the edge of a volcano. For 20 years, through sheer force of will, political genius and military prowess, Aetius was its undisputed master. Gaul, though fractured, remained nominally Roman because Aetius willed it so. But the delicate balance Aetius had so painstakingly constructed was built upon a single, terrifying pillar, his alliance with the Huns and specifically with their king, Rua, and later, his nephews, Bleda and Attila. For years, this relationship was the engine of Aetius's power. The gold of Rome, squeezed from a dwindling tax base, flowed east in a steady stream to the Hunnic encampments on the great Hungarian plain, buying the services of their swift, merciless cavalry. In return, Aetius held a sword of Damocles over the head of every Germanic king in Gaul. The threat of the Huns was the glue holding his system together. He was, in effect, a protection racket on an imperial scale. However, a storm was brewing on the steppe that would shatter this arrangement. After the death of King Rua, power was shared uneasily between his nephews, Bleda and Attila. Attila, even as a co-ruler, was the more ambitious and charismatic of the two. Roman ambassadors, like the historian Priscus who visited his camp, described him as a man of unassuming dress but piercing eyes, a leader who could inspire fanatical loyalty and utter terror in equal measure. He saw the Roman Empire not as a partner, but as a cow to be milked dry. In 445, the fragile dual kingship ended abruptly and violently. Attila murdered his brother Bleda and became the sole ruler of a unified Hunnic empire that stretched from the foothills of the Alps to the Caspian Sea, a confederation of dozens of subservient tribes. He was no longer a petty king to be bought off with Roman gold. He now saw himself as the scourge of God, destined to rule the world. The relationship between Aetius and Attila was one of the most fascinating and complex in history. They knew each other from Aetius's time as a hostage. They were, in a strange way, foster brothers of the sword, men who understood each other's minds. There are even accounts, perhaps apocryphal, that Aetius sent Attila a secretary named Constantius as a gift, a man who would later help the Hun king draft his arrogant demands to Ravenna. But that personal connection now meant nothing against the tidal wave of Attila's ambition. The delicate diplomacy between Ravenna and the Huns became a tense, high-stakes bluff. Attila began to test the limits, demanding more gold, making outrageous diplomatic claims. One famous pretext was his demand for the hand of Honoria, the Emperor Valentinian's sister, who had allegedly sent him a ring asking for help after a scandalous affair. Attila treated this as a legitimate marriage proposal and demanded half the Western Empire as her dowry. The Roman world held its breath. The weapon Aetius had wielded for so long was now turning its point directly against the heart of the empire he had sworn to protect. The devil was demanding his due. The crisis erupted with the fury of a steppe blizzard in the spring of 451. Using the Honoria pretext, Attila amassed the greatest barbarian army Europe had ever seen. It was not a horde of mindless savages, but a sophisticated, multi-ethnic force. The core was the Hunnic horse archers, born in the saddle, masters of the feigned retreat and the deadly plunging arrow storm. But they were joined by a vast array of subject peoples. Ostrogoths under their three kings, Theodomir, Valamir and Widimir, Gepids under their king Ardaric, Rugi, Siri, Heruli and many others, who added the mass and heavy infantry that the Huns traditionally lacked. This was not a mere raid for plunder. It was an invasion of conquest, aimed at the very soul of the West. In the spring, the Horde, a moving city of warriors, families and wagons, numbering in the hundreds of thousands, according to terrified chroniclers, though modern estimates suggest a more realistic, yet still formidable 70,000, 100,000 fighting men, crossed the Rhine near the modern city of Koblenz. The earth shook for miles around from the thunder of hoofbeats. The cities of Gaul, which had known a fragile Aetian peace, were the first to feel the fire of this new apocalypse. The Roman frontier defences crumbled to dust before the onslaught. Divodurum, Metz, was stormed, its bishop and congregation slaughtered in its churches. The horde swept towards the Loire, its ultimate goal unclear. Perhaps to subdue the Visigoths in Toulouse, perhaps to strike at the heart of Gaul itself. Its destructive path was a lesson in psychological warfare. Terror was its vanguard. The very fabric of civilization seemed to be unraveling before its advance, as if the clock were being turned back 1,000 years. In this moment of existential threat, Aetius faced the greatest challenge of his life. His old strategy of playing barbarian against barbarian was useless. His special weapon was now his enemy. He was politically isolated. His influence in Ravenna weakened by court rivals like the eunuch Heraclius, who whispered that he had created this very monster through his long association with the Huns. The Emperor Valentinian, a weak and vacillating man, was likely paralyzed with fear. What happened next was the ultimate testament to Aetius's genius and the respect he commanded. Aetius, the pragmatist, became Aetius, the unifier of Christendom. He embarked on a desperate diplomatic mission that was nothing short of revolutionary. He rode with a small escort into the court of Theodoric the First, the aged, proud, and deeply suspicious king of the Visigoths, in their capital of Toulouse. For decades, the Visigoths had been rivals, sometimes allies, often enemies of Rome. Theodoric had fought Aetius before and had no love for him or the Roman Empire, but Aetius made him an offer he could not refuse, an argument of stark, brutal logic. Join me or be destroyed piecemeal by Attila. He argued that the Huns recognized no distinction between Roman and Goth. They were a threat to all settled peoples, to the very concept of civilitas and the Christian faith itself. He painted a picture of a world ruled by steppe nomads, where cities, laws, and churches would be erased. Miraculously, Theodoric, putting aside generations of enmity, agreed. In that moment, Aetius forged an army that had not been seen since the days of the early Republic, a true Roman barbarian coalition for the salvation of the West. He gathered what Roman troops he could, a pale shadow of the legions of old, and united them with the entire martial strength of the Visigothic nation, their fierce infantry and heavy cavalry. He was joined by the Alans of King Sangiban, whom he stationed at Orléans, the Burgundians, who remembered the lesson Aetius's Huns had taught their fathers, and even some Frankish contingents, themselves divided in their loyalty between Rome and the rising power of the Merovingians. It was a fragile, fractious alliance, a sword with a cracked hilt, held together solely by the force of Aetius's will, his legendary reputation, and the shared, primal fear of Attila. The two colossal forces converged on the rolling plains of Champagne. Attila, perhaps surprised by the speed and unity of Aetius's response, had besieged the strategic city of Orléans, a key crossing on the Loire. The city's bishop, Annianus, became a symbol of defiance, tirelessly encouraging the defenders and reportedly sending desperate messages to Aetius. If you are not here by such and such a day, we are lost. As Aetius's coalition army approached, its dust cloud visible on the horizon, Attila broke the siege and began a tactical retreat eastward, seeking more favourable ground for his cavalry. He found it near the city of Duro Catalaunum, modern-day Châlons-en-Champagne. Here, on a vast, open plain dominated by a long sloping ridge, the fate of Western civilization would be decided in a single, bloody afternoon. The Catalonian fields were not a single, neat battlefield, but a sprawling area of ridges, shallow valleys, and a prominent hill that would become the focal point of the struggle. Aetius, with the eye of a master tactician, understood the terrain perfectly. He secured the high ground on the right flank of the Allied line for his Visigothic allies under King Theodoric. His own Romans, alongside the Franks and other auxiliaries, held the left flank. In the centre, he deliberately placed the Alans of Sangiban, whose loyalty he rightly suspected was weak and wavering. This was a calculated risk. He was forcing Attila to attack his strongest points on the flanks, or gamble on shattering the unreliable centre. On June 20th, 451, under a brooding summer sky, the armies deployed for battle. It was a sight to freeze the blood of any man, a panorama of ancient and modern warfare. On one side, the motley but determined coalition of Romans and Germans, their banners a mix of fading imperial eagles and tribal totems, their armour a mixture of Roman mail and barbarian leather and fur. On the other, the endless, chaotic and terrifying swarm of the Hunnic horde. The Huns, with their distinctive pointed skulls, a result of cranial binding, their short, powerful bows, and their ragged furs, were a vision from a nightmare. The air was filled with a cacophony of wild war cries. The deep-throated chants of the Germans, the shrill whistling of the Huns, and the solemn, disciplined silence of the Roman lines. The battle began in the late afternoon. Attila, seeing the vulnerable Alans in the centre and trusting in the shock of his cavalry, launched his main assault there, a thunderous, earth-shaking charge of his best Hunnic horsemen aimed at splitting the Allied line in two. But Aetius had anticipated this. The Alans buckled under the ferocious impact, as expected, but they did not break entirely, their own cavalry meeting the Huns in a maelstrom of slashing swords and lances. This was the critical moment. As the Hunnic charge lost its momentum, entangled in the centre, Aetius unleashed his flanks. On the right, the Visigoths, under the aged King Theodoric, poured down from the ridge in a massive, crashing wave of steel and fury. Theodoric himself was in the thick of the fighting, a white-haired lion until he was cut down, allegedly by a thrown spear from an Ostrogoth in Attila's army. His death, rather than breaking the Goths, ignited their rage. His son, Thorismund, was hailed as king on the battlefield and took up the charge, his fury fueling the Gothic assault. On the left, Aetius himself, likely fighting on foot with his Bucellari, led his Romans in a methodical, disciplined advance, pushing back the Ostrogothic subjects of Attila. The battle then disintegrated into 1,000 individual struggles across the plain. It was not a classic set-piece battle of elegant maneuver, but a colossal, brutal slogging match, a battle of nations, where the discipline of Aetius's Romans and the ferocity of his Gothic allies ground down the tactical flexibility of the Huns. The fighting was most intense around the hill that dominated the centre of the field. The chronicler Jordanes, writing a century later, describes a stream on the battlefield running red with blood, and men slaking their thirst in it, a scene of apocalyptic horror. The Frankish allies on the Roman side fought with such desperation that it was said the following day 15,000 bodies were found on the spot where they had clashed with their enemies. As darkness fell, the outcome was still indecisive, but the Hunnic army was battered, bloodied, and strategically checkmated. Attila, for the first time in his life, had been stopped. He withdrew behind a laager of wagons, prepared to die in a final fiery stand. His saddles and possessions piled high for a funeral pyre should the Romans break through. But Aetius, the master strategist to the very end, made one last coldly calculated move. As dawn broke on the 21st of June, the Allied commanders surveyed the field of carnage. Thorismund, the new Visigothic king, was eager to storm the wagon fort and claim the ultimate prize, the head of Attila. But Aetius dissuaded him. He used a powerful political argument. Thorismund must return to Toulouse immediately to secure his throne against his ambitious brothers, arguing that a power vacuum there would be more disastrous than allowing Attila to escape. It was a brilliant, cynical ploy. With the Visigoths gone, the coalition lost its offensive power. Aetius then allowed Attila and the shattered remnants of his army to escape back across the Rhine. It was a decision that has puzzled and divided historians for centuries. Why let the monster go? For Aetius, it was the purest pragmatism. His goal was not the annihilation of Attila, but the preservation of the balance of power he had spent his life building. A destroyed Hunnic empire would leave the Visigoths as the unchallenged, dominant power in Gaul, a threat to Ravenna as great as Attila himself. He needed them both weakened, locked in a stalemate that only he could manage. He had won the battle, but he was still playing the long game. The Battle of the Catalonian Fields was Aetius's masterpiece, his Cannae, his Gaugamela. He had done the impossible. He had united the squabbling factions of the West and turned back the most fearsome invasion in living memory. He had saved Rome, and in that moment he was the saviour of the empire, the greatest Roman since Scipio Africanus or Julius Caesar. He returned to Italy in 452, not to a traditional triumph through the streets of Rome, but to face a new and perhaps more insidious crisis. Attila, humiliated but not broken, had licked his wounds and now turned his fury on Italy itself. He crossed the Julian Alps, bypassing the well-defended city of Aquileia at first, then returning to besiege it when a divine omen, so the story goes, of storks flying away from the city convinced him it was doomed. He sacked it so utterly, so completely, that it virtually disappeared from the map, its refugees fleeing to the lagoons that would one day become Venice. He burned Patavium, Padua, Verona, and Mediolanum, Milan, his armies spreading terror to the very gates of Rome itself. Emperor Valentinian III fled Ravenna in a panic for the safer walls of Rome. Once again, it fell to Aetius. But his army was spent, his Gothic allies were in Toulouse, and he had no force capable of meeting the Huns in open battle, so he waged a campaign of harassment and attrition, a true general's war. Using his intimate knowledge of the Italian landscape and his small mobile forces, he harried the Huns, cutting their supply lines, attacking foraging parties, and making their advance a costly, miserable affair. The Italian summer, so different from the dry steppe, brought disease and famine to Attila's camp. And then, at the most critical juncture, a delegation from the emperor, led by the formidable Pope Leo I himself, met Attila on the banks of the Mincio River near Mantua. The miracle of Pope Leo turning back the Huns with mere words is a cornerstone of Catholic legend, a story of divine intervention. But behind the spiritual authority of the Pope, clad in his full vestments, stood the grim, practical reality of Aetius's guerrilla war, a depleted and diseased Hunnic army, and rumours of threats to Attila's own realm from the Eastern Roman army. Faced with this combination of divine aura, military pressure, and strategic concerns, Attila, ever the pragmatist himself, withdrew from Italy. For the second time in 2 years, Aetius had saved the Roman West from annihilation. He was, without question, the most powerful man in the Western world. But the political landscape of Ravenna was more treacherous and deadly than any battlefield. Aetius, at the height of his power and fame, was now a mortal threat to the man he served. He had arranged for his son, Gaudentius, to be betrothed to Valentinian's daughter, Placidia, a move that suggested he was planning to found a dynasty to make his family the new imperial house. The emperor, a weak, paranoid, and deeply insecure man, had long chafed under the shadow of his great general. He was surrounded by scheming courtiers, like the powerful eunuch Heraclius, who constantly whispered that Aetius aimed for the purple himself, that his power made the emperor a mere figurehead, that the saviour of Rome was now its greatest danger. The very successes that had saved the empire now sealed its saviour's fate. The jealousy and fear in Valentinian's heart festered into homicidal rage. On September 21st, 454, Aetius was in the palace in Ravenna, attending a meeting of the imperial consistory. He was presenting a detailed financial petition to the emperor, likely related to paying his troops, the lifeblood of his power. It was a routine administrative meeting. As Aetius leaned over the accounts, explaining the figures, Valentinian III suddenly leaped from his throne, drawing his sword. He screamed accusations of treason. Heraclius, the eunuch, and other courtiers, primed for this moment, joined him. In a frenzied, cowardly attack, they stabbed the last great Roman general to death. There were no loyal guards to intervene, no last stand. Flavius Aetius, the man who had defeated Attila the Hun, the master of soldiers for 3 decades, the last wall of the empire, fell in a pool of his own blood on the marble floor of the palace he had fought his whole life to protect. It was not a soldier's death, but the death of a sacrificial animal in a den of courtiers. The consequences of this short-sighted, stupid act of political murder were as swift as they were catastrophic. With Aetius gone, the delicate, complex balance of power he had maintained for 2 decades shattered instantly. There was no one left in the Western Empire who could command the loyalty of the army, manage the barbarian allies, or intimidate the enemies of Rome. The structure of the state, which he had personally held together, collapsed like a house of cards. One of Aetius's own former officers, a wealthy Roman senator named Petronius Maximus, who had his own scores to settle with Valentinian, was seething with revenge for the death of his patron. The following year, in March 455, he orchestrated the assassination of Valentinian III, as the emperor practiced military drills on the Campus Martius outside Rome. The line of Theodosius was extinguished. Petronius Maximus seized the throne, but his reign was measured in weeks. In the ensuing chaos, the Vandals under King Gaiseric, whom Aetius had kept contained and wary in Africa, saw their opportunity. With no Aetius to oppose them, they sailed across the Mediterranean, landed at the mouth of the Tiber, and in June of 455, sacked Rome with a thoroughness and systematic plunder that made Alaric's sack look tame. They stripped the city of its remaining treasures, including the gilded bronze tiles from the roof of the Temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus on the Capitoline Hill, and even the Empress Eudoxia and her daughters, carrying them off to Carthage as hostages. The Vandal sack became synonymous with mindless destruction, a fitting epitaph for the world Aetius had left behind. The Western Roman Empire was now leaderless, bankrupt, and spiritually broken. In the 2 decades following Aetius's murder, a succession of powerless, pathetic emperors, nicknamed the Shadow Emperors, Avitus, Majorian, Libius Severus, Anthemius, Julius Nepos, were puppets of barbarian generals like the Suebian Ricimer, the true power behind the throne. Majorian, to his credit, tried to emulate Aetius and almost succeeded, but he was betrayed and murdered by Ricimer. The empire was a corpse being fought over by undertakers. It limped on, a political fiction, until 476, when the Germanic general Odoacer, commander of the Federati in Italy, simply deposed the last emperor, the boy Romulus Augustulus, little Augustus. Odoacer did not bother to kill him. He pensioned him off to a villa in Campania. He then sent the imperial regalia to the emperor in Constantinople, Zeno, with a message that the West no longer needed an emperor of its own. One man, Odoacer, would now rule Italy as a client of the East. It was not a dramatic fall, but a quiet administrative whimper. The Western Roman Empire was no more. The death of Flavius Aetius was more than the murder of a man. It was the suicide of an empire. He was called the last of the Romans because he was the last man who possessed the combination of skill, will, authority, and profound understanding to make the whole creaking, collapsing edifice work. He fought not with the ghostly legions of the past, but with the messy, imperfect tools of the present: diplomacy, bribery, mercenaries, terror, and a brilliant, pragmatic, strategic mind that saw the world as it was, not as it should be. He held the line for a generation, giving the provinces of Gaul and Italy a final, precious respite, a last echo of the Pax Romana during which the seeds of the future could be planted. His victory at the Catalonian fields, while not decisive in a tactical sense, was of immense strategic and psychological importance. It bought time, precious decades during which the classical culture, law, and administrative traditions of Rome could be absorbed, preserved, and transformed by the very barbarian kingdoms that were replacing the empire. The Visigothic code, the Frankish state, even the nascent power of the papacy, all owed their formative period to the space that Aetius's struggles created. He could not save the Roman Empire. Its internal rot, economic collapse, demographic decline, political corruption was too advanced. The fall was inevitable, but he managed its end with a skill and determination that bordered on the superhuman. He fought a desperate 30-year rearguard action against the twilight, holding back the night with his own 2 hands. He was the man who stood alone, for a fleeting moment, between order and chaos, between the world of antiquity and the coming Dark Ages. He understood the rules of the new game and played it better than anyone else. And when he fell, struck down not by a barbarian's sword but by the knife of the emperor he had saved, the last light was extinguished. The night finally descended, and the long, cold winter of the Middle Ages began. The story of Aetius is the story of the fall of Rome, a tragedy of immense proportions, where the saviour is destroyed by the very thing he saves, and the greatest victory merely postpones the inevitable.